Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast all about your Kindle. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is August 11th, 2017. Welcome from Ocean Park, Maine. I think that this 471st episode of the podcast is going to bring you something you've never heard before here, an interview that lasts the entire show. My guest is Jon P. Fine, a graduate of Cornell and the University of Virginia Law School, who held key legal posts at NBC and Random House before he joined Amazon in 2006. His 9 years in Seattle placed him at the epicenter of Amazon's disruption of the book industry. When he left Amazon in 2015, his title was Director of Author and Publishing Relations. I reached Jon in New York by Skype on Tuesday, August 8th. I began by asking if he recalled any particular issues that came up while he was providing in-house legal advice to the creators and cast of NBC's hit satire and comedy show Saturday Night Live.
I do remember we did a skit with Neil Diamond where we portrayed Neil Diamond as a drug mule. And I want to say it was that he was doing a duet with Britney Spears, but he had just gotten off the plane and the drugs started to leak. And I went up to them before the show and I said, are we doing this because of some history of Neil Diamond, or are we just doing this, to poke fun at Neil Diamond? And they looked at me and they said, we're just poking fun at Neil Diamond. And I said, okay. And it's actually the only time I was worried about a potential claim. And at the end of the day, 6 months later, Neil Diamond came on and played himself in a skit. So it all went well.
So if the answer had been no, there is some history, then that would have been when you said this is a little too risky?
No, actually, I would have said the opposite. I mean, then we would have had a legitimate peg.
I see.
Making fun of something that actually happened. And really, as a lawyer for Inside Edition, I started the day after OJ hit the road in his Bronco in 94, understanding the different arguments you make to justify news reporting or satire parody. There's a range of different possibilities. One is you're making fun of something that actually happened. And the other is the speech is so hyperbolic that no damage would have come about because nobody would have believed it. It was just so ridiculous. And so there was no damage done, hence no successful lawsuit for libel. And so, it's funny. You could paint a spectrum there that essentially immunizes you from any kind of libel claim. So I don't want to, I'm oversimplifying dramatically, but it was very interesting to me from an intellectual standpoint, but only for a few minutes.
I could see this playing out in a different environment at Random House, where you were Associate General Counsel for 5 years at Knopf. How did that setting for the intellectual challenge of your work compare with NBC and Saturday Night Live?
Well, and so here was the problem with NBC. NBC was part of GE, and it's still this way, not part of GE, but the law department is really focused, and this is true throughout the industry. From a legal services standpoint, specialization is really driven hard, so that when you go into a large company like NBC, this is your specialty, content review. You're not doing litigation. You're not doing corporate development or M&A. You're not doing employment law or HR. You're just doing that one thing. And it was an amazing proving ground from the standpoint of content review, which was far and away the most interesting aspect of it to me. But it wasn't rocket science. And after a while, it felt limiting. I got to do other things at NBC, but I was very lucky and I had to push hard. And so one of these serendipitous moments, my boss at NBC was supposed to do a libel law conference in London, got sick, and so I went and spoke in his stead. And as a result of that, I was approached literally in London by somebody who asked if I was interested in working in publishing as a lawyer. And I said, come on, I'm just got promoted at NBC. I'm the lawyer for Saturday Night Live. No way. It doesn't sound interesting to me. But then I said, but what publishing house? And they told me Knopf. And I said, oh, I am very interested. And so I actually had an interview in London with the General Counsel for all of Random House, Inc., which owns Knopf, and over fish and chips. And then met with Sonny Mehta, and we had a great lunch, and then I joined Knopf. And one of the attractions of joining Knopf, beyond its incredible history, I view the New Yorker and Knopf as the premier publishing organizations in the U.S. There was this wildly expansive movement for my responsibilities. I went from just handling content to handling everything essentially associated with the publishing house. And one of the very first things I got to do, it was secret at the time. I got called into Sonny's office a couple of months after I got to Knopf, and he said, "Close the door. So we have made a deal confidentially to buy President Clinton's memoirs." He had just left office.
Oh.
And the expectation was that, like Hillary's first memoir, Bob Barnett, their lawyer, would open it up to auction. And so for months, everybody was waiting for the auction to start, nobody knowing that essentially we had struck a deal and were just working through the paperwork. And so it was a fascinating exercise because, frankly, I had written small agreements, but I was not a contracts person, nor did I have any experience in publishing law, directly, contract law. So that actually, I think, ended up being useful in the sense that I was not intellectually restrained by the way things had always been done. We had to come up with sort of a unique structure, which I can't really tell you a lot about. The only thing that people know is, and that was kept secret up until Hillary's run for president, unbelievably, that the advance was the largest for any single book. I think it still is, at $15 million. And it was a fascinating exercise because my role in it was negotiating and drafting the agreement in a very confidential setting, and then I was very active in the publishing process. So it really is a great template for explaining how much more broadly I think my talents were tapped and how much more I learned, frankly, than if I had stayed at NBC.
Well, now then, you joined Amazon in 2006 as Director of Copyright and Media Law. How would you compare that environment to what you'd left at Random House in terms of the scope of your duties and just the whole kind of work you were doing?
Well, it was interesting. So the pace was very different, obviously, and I knew that going in. So the way I got to Amazon, just to put a little color behind this, and it relates to other stuff that may be of interest to your listeners. Near the end of my tenure at Random House, at Knopf, we initiated, we were not named as a plaintiff, but along with other publishers and the AAP, we initiated litigation against Google over Google Book Search. Because, and I still believe this, notwithstanding the court's rulings just recently over the last couple of years, that, essentially they were copying, and that was helping them build full-length texts, and that was helping them build, this is 2005, 2004, the iconic nature worth of their search engine. They're incorporating tons of content. And under copyright law, and frankly, also from a moral standpoint, while I love the idea of creating an Alexandria library, and while there's tons of friction in terms of getting rights to do that, under the regime that we established under the Copyright Act, and frankly under a moral sense, I felt like what they were doing was wrong. And so we hired Debevoise and Plimpton, actually, my old law firm, to start the litigation. And very quickly after the litigation started, I got contacted by Google, and they recruited me for a legal job at Google. And it was intriguing, no doubt. They had just bought YouTube. I think that's probably where I would have landed because of my television experience and because, frankly, they knew of my opposition to Google Book Search. And so I had a job offer from them, and then I got a call from Amazon, who had heard that I had gotten an offer from Google and were looking to create this new role, and went out there, interviewed, and felt that was a better fit for me for a variety of reasons, including, locale. I grew up in New York. Being in a city was important to me. Seattle's a great city. But also the work they were doing, and frankly, at the time, Amazon was seen as a savior. And so in my mind, from a moral standpoint, remember, it was just at the beginning of moving from a David to Goliath. And at the time, publishers were embracing Amazon as an alternative to the,
to Google.
Incredible power. Well, actually, no, to Barnes and Noble.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so it was, and there were other, frankly, on the Google book search thing, for example, Amazon had started its own similar program, though for different purposes, called Look Inside the Book and Search Inside the Book. And actually, Knopf was one of the first, because I pushed it, publishers to put their books into that program. There were hiccups around it, but they were at least looking and getting permission to do the things that Google was trying to do, but not getting permission for. So Amazon seemed like a great opportunity. I knew that it was going to be much more intense than what, say, Knopf had been like. And in fact, it was. It was akin to going back to being an investment banker, which I had done before I went to law school in the 80s, except I was twice as old as I had been. And so it was an intense experience, and I enjoyed the law department. But I also found at the time, and I can understand this from a larger corporate perspective, it felt more like that babysitting function. That's too easy a word. It felt less facilitative than I would have liked. And I think, and this is just conjecture on my part, that essentially, from a corporate perspective, top down, they're going to drive the business to be as aggressive and ambitious as possible. And a lot of younger folks, this is, Amazon was still relatively small, certainly relative to its size today. So a little less experience. So you needed a firmer hand from the law department. I found that chafing to me. So I'd actually decided to leave Amazon. But we had just finished the Brilliance acquisition, and I had helped on that. And I got a call from the head of the books team saying, hey, you're probably not interested, you're probably too busy, but do you want to help us integrate this acquisition into our larger company? And I said, you don't know this yet, it's still confidential, but I'm leaving. And he said, oh, you have time. So I made the decision to stay at Amazon, but to move out of the legal department to the business and also to Grand Haven, where I helped basically integrate, along with a couple of other folks, Brilliance, a small, very traditional Midwestern company, into the digital behemoth that Amazon was becoming.
Let's talk a little bit about Brilliance, because when I saw that, I had heard about it, but I didn't really know what it does. They are doing audiobooks basically on special CDs, and they're not part of Audible, and their identification with Amazon seems fairly glancing on the website. What type of a business is that, and where does it stand at Amazon now, or when you left?
Well, it's doing very well. So Brilliance Audio was one of the pioneers of audiobook publishing. They have the number of cassettes back in the 80s necessary to listen to an audiobook, because they were able to sort of record dual tracks. And so people, at the time, it was all cassettes. And then it became CDs. But it was a traditional audiobook publisher, and actually predating Audible. And probably, I want to say they were fifth or sixth largest audiobook publisher at the time we purchased them. So very well established, and very well known, very well respected, and seen as an opportunity to extend the storytelling operations that we were starting to look at in Seattle, and eventually, moving into not just selling books, but providing the capability for people to publish on their own or be published by Amazon. So glancing or otherwise, there is certainly an Amazon effect when companies are purchased. And sometimes it's helpful to broadcast the connection very loudly, and sometimes less so. Everybody in the publishing community certainly knows and has known for a long time that Amazon owns Brilliance. As to the separation from Audible, we bought Audible just about a year. And in fact, I helped on that transaction after we bought Brilliance. And it just has made sense, I think, so far for things to exist the way they are. Brilliance Publishing reports up to the head of Amazon Publishing. So it is integrated very directly. And all three, Amazon Publishing, Audible, and Brilliance coordinate very closely together. In New York, they share offices. And so, Brilliance is a vital part of the Grand Haven, Michigan scene. A great town, by the way, on the shore of Lake Michigan. So that's the way I would explain that.
So that's how you got out of the law department at Amazon and into the books team. And this is coming on, at that time, did you know the Kindle was in the works? Because it didn't get released till November of 2007.
I'm always my memory sucks. Yeah, I'm sure it was. In fact, I knew it was. But it's funny, I don't think about it that way necessarily. And Amazon works on a siloed basis largely, and so you're not as deeply knowledgeable. The idea is not to silo for the sake of siloing. It's because that's how we feel we get our work done best. Heads down, focused on your goal. Don't let noise and signals from outside impact you too greatly. So, a lot of people were working on different parts of all this. And it's, at the end of the day, if you look at it from a customer perspective, which is what Amazon does resolutely, it's figuring out from the inside what's the best way to meet those customer needs. And it might be some duplicative effort depending on how products and content were developed.
As you transitioned over to working on books, what were some of the first projects that you were working on in that period after the...
After Brilliance? Well, so the role that I was brought in to do really evolved over time in reaction to whatever needs there might be that I could effectively fill. But at its heart, at the beginning, was this sense that we were going from David to Goliath. And with that, and with Amazon as a tech company, it's not an open kimono sort of company. People in the industry trying to figure out what we were doing. I think tenacious Amazon has always been in terms of its negotiations with vendors, because the goal is to get the best possible price for customers, the best possible experience, I should say. And that involves price and delivery and all kinds of things. But price is an important part of that. So that was creating some challenges, I think, for Amazon at the time. And not just there, but also in the nascent independent author market. There were some dust-ups. I can't recall them all when BookSurge, before it became CreateSpace, was still BookSurge. And so the idea was to create a position that could be community-facing and work on a number of different levels. We hadn't been really a presence at any of the normal events in the book world. Again, just not something that we think helps us deliver to customers. But at the same time, as we grew, it became clear, I think, to folks that we needed to have more of a presence. So part of my job was getting out into the community, whether at BEA or RWA or Frankfurt, or even small local writers groups in the Pacific Northwest and around the country, and just sort of let them know what Amazon has for authors or publishers. Also on a more, I'd say, narrow casting basis, coming to New York on a regular basis to meet with industry leaders, the author and publisher community on a more individualized basis, and not be somebody who was necessarily trying to sell a program, but being more of an ambassador, an interpreter, an explainer of what Amazon was doing on the one hand, but also somebody who could bring concerns and needs back to the folks at Amazon and help us think about how we were doing things. And then we also, as part of that, and part of a commitment to demonstrating how much we cared about the community, we created a giving program that really the focus was, and the story behind it was, look, we are being disruptive in this business, this messaging to the author and publishing community. There's no doubt we're being disruptive, but we can all agree that catalyzing the creation of new works is a principle we can all agree upon. And so we started to support a range of organizations in the nonprofit space that were focused on helping authors write books. And the idea was there were a few different ways to do that. We could have given grants directly to writers, which I believe Amazon is starting to do now on a more programmatic basis. But I felt working with organizations who could help understand what we were doing and explain it to their people was a more scalable approach, since I was essentially embarking on this endeavor on my own. And the fund continues. It's now called the Amazon Literary Partnership. It's run by a great guy named Neil Thompson, who is also an author. And I think it's been incredibly effective at helping these small groups around the country, particularly in the face of drying up grants and other resources. In fact, I don't know if it's still true, but at a certain point, really soon after we started it, even the NEA was telling people that Amazon was the largest private funder of literary nonprofits in the country, if not the world. I don't know if that's still the case. It wouldn't surprise me if it is. But,
yeah. Because when you left, I think the total contributed was more than $5 million to more than 100 nonprofits. Do you think that rate of, or that scale of support has continued since?
Yes, I do. I think it's even increased. And I think even that number is probably a little low by 2014, just based on the numbers I'm familiar with. But I think that scale is appropriate. And it was, we were not looking to reach the general public. Our target audience for this message of, look, we're disruptive, but we're also part of this community, was resolutely targeted towards the author and publishing community.
Well, the other, I don't know if this fell within the time that you were still at Amazon, but the very public dispute with Hachette during those contract negotiations in 2014, I think, given your legal background and that you had worked in the publishing industry, did you have any kind of a role in those negotiations which ended up being so contentious?
No, I did not. I mean, not directly. Certainly, I had the ear of folks in Seattle, and I had an opportunity and need to, address concerns being raised by the dance between Hachette and Amazon. I think there was both sides could have approached it more effectively, and I think both sides have learned. And I believe that new negotiations have just started with the Big Five. Maybe with Simon & Schuster, I'm not sure.
And this would have been the first negotiations since 2014?
That I can't speak to. Look, to paraphrase, I think Oscar Wilde, vis-a-vis Amazon and Hachette, we were all of us in the gutter, and none of us were looking at the stars. And I think that there's ample opportunity on both sides to think about and improve how to handle these situations going forward, and hopefully we'll see evidence of that.
So the evidence would be that we won't be reading about these negotiations.
Yes and no. I mean, I think maybe. Or if you read about them, there seems to be more logic to the communications and the way it was reported. I think there are certain reporters and newspapers who covered the story with a certain bit of lack of objectivity in certain ways. And I don't want to go too farther into that, but I do think I should add the media coverage, at least in certain places, was not what it could be or what I would have expected from those places.
I agree.
Part of that problem there was Amazon's, I think, unwillingness at times to speak effectively about these issues. And by the way, that's not necessarily a mistake. I think there was a lot of intentionality around that because of the ethos. Look, we're trying to get things done for our customers. This is sort of noise. But in a highly visible area of the media, which can be very navel-gazing, it's important to at least understand what that may mean in terms of impact. And this is the thing that I think still a lot of folks in the author and publishing community, traditional author and publishing community, don't understand that outside of that community, I don't want to say outside New York, though this is where it's largely centered, I was spending a lot of time traveling the country and hearing, and the world, and hearing how much people loved Amazon. And so, again, it's a complicated story. Hopefully, if it's told again, it's told well, and we'll see what happens.
The other thing that you had a chance to experience from both sides, Amazon and outside of Amazon in this period, is this remarkable transition from vanity press to self-publishing to indie publishing, a real sort of transformation of the way people think about people who publish their own books. Do you think that the transformation is completed now, or
no? It's not. And thank you. You summarized it perfectly. That's exactly how you summarized it perfectly from my standpoint, because that's exactly how I would have said it. That transformation from vanity to self to indie was very much a part of what we were doing. And it reflected a decision, around the time I got back to Seattle, that authors are going to be customers, and customers with a capital C. And I don't want to dive too deep on this because it's sort of corporate philosophy. But Amazon is very focused on serving customers with a capital C. That's our goal. We want them to have the best customer experience. And then the question becomes, who are customers, right? The easiest customers are the folks who are buying things on our website, obviously, customers from day one. Other customers would include the companies who use AWS, a different kind of customer entirely, and a customer class that developed much more recently. Around 2007, 2008, there was this decision that authors, as creators of content, should be customers. And what that meant internally was a real focus on authors as who we are trying to please, which can be an oxymoronic effort. That's what I call aspirational, right? Making authors happy. And I say that in the nicest way. Authors are some of the toughest customers you can possibly have. Because, and I understand this, they're handing over their child, their baby, and they want to ensure that it's cared for and coddled. And so there's an emotional component there, which is ironic given Amazon's, scalable technological beast, right? That it would be so focused on serving people with a very emotional, not always logical approach to their work. But that was the decision. And so what that meant, and I don't want to overstate this, but there's a useful metaphor that the old E.F. Hutton commercials suggest, where you might be at at Forest Hills and a really noisy environment, and somebody says, "Well, my broker's E.F. Hutton."
Yeah.
And E.F. Hutton says, and this is in the 70s and 80s, and I really felt that was in practice at Amazon, where obviously you'd go into a room and you'd talk about new programs and proposals, and that, somebody would say, that's not good for retail buyers, and somebody else, and I would be able to say, well, wait a second, from an author perspective, this change isn't good or this change is good. And people would listen. It carried weight. It doesn't mean that it ruled the day, but it was a very clear identification of a priority. And you saw it in the resources that were devoted to developing the Kindle platform in the first instance. Look, millions of people can tell, at times, crappy stories now around the world. I think that's amazing. I think that is remarkable. And I don't view it necessarily as these are all publishable books that people will want to buy. I view it from an empowerment standpoint. Look, in the same way that writers in the schools programs that we help support, they bring authors to the schools to teach kids writing. And, the hope is one of these kids will become the next great American or British or Indian novelist. But really, I think the powerful effect of those WITS classes and the powerful effect of being able to publish your story no matter where you are on Kindle is that you can tell your story. It's empowering, even if it's just for your family. And so, people complain about the surfeit of books, and I've talked about, the tsunami of content, except the waters are not receding. And people worry about the impact on book sales. I guess, as a First Amendment lawyer, that's a high-class problem, too many stories. And so, anyway, that aspect of what Kindle did was amazing. But I also think it created a very highly professionalized class of independent authors. I do think there are still huge challenges involved in the transformation. Look, there is no doubt, I think, in the abstract, and I would never give this advice to anybody in the abstract because I think it's a highly individualized assessment. But in the abstract, there's no doubt in my mind, for a variety of reasons, that a traditional deal with most publishing houses is probably best still for most authors. And that, again, has to do with the personality of the author. It has to do with the type of content they're creating, the type of audience they're trying to reach. So all of those things come into play. If you're doing, a great sci-fi fantasy series, doing it on your own may be a great and effective way to do it, assuming you can build an audience. But there are still issues around the independent path to publishing that people have to reckon with. And this horrible metaphor that I have is sort of, we've paved the highway, we've created the opportunity, but there are still a lot of service areas and exit ramps and entrance ramps onto that highway that need to be built. When I say that, I mean, for example, there isn't an easy way to breach the academic market if you're an independent author, if that's your goal. Traditional publishing has those things baked in, right? There are paths, there are marketing teams that can reach those groups, the schools. Translations, right? It's hard. It's getting easier, but it's hard to have a translation made if you're not traditionally published. Amazon has in beta, I think, still a translator's matchmaking service, and I think we'll see more of those things. But right now, it's still a challenge. Movies and TV and theater and other kinds of production opportunities, those folks looking for content have established pipelines that they need to expand, but they haven't yet, I think. Some of them are doing it, but not always. Those pipelines don't naturally connect independent authors into them. And so audio is probably the example where independent authors have made the greatest inroads, and I actually think it's the most powerful place they can. I think audio, as a storytelling medium from the digital side, has frankly a higher ceiling for an audience than print or digital from a book side. I think that reflects the way we can weave audio into our lives without having to sit down and read a book and focus just on reading the book. Multitasking while listening to audio content is a natural thing. And so I just think the audience is larger. And what's happened with audio in terms of these sort of, when I talk about service areas that independent authors can tap, well, it was very hard for a variety of reasons to get an audio made of your book, even if you were a traditional author. The costs were prohibitive.
Right.
Unless you could establish a market, it required a great investment. Technology has not only driven down the costs, I mean, what you're doing, I think, would have been much more expensive 10 years ago,
right.
For example.
Yeah.
But not only driven down the costs in terms of production, in terms of the costs of goods sold, but also ubiquified the content in a way that makes it much easier for people to get to. So all of that, I think, will contribute to a huge market that you can see people very much focused on, Audible being, I think, the leader. But what Audible did was build out essentially a matchmaking service. You may or may not be familiar.
ACX.
ACX.
Yeah. What's that stands for? Audible something exchange? Audible
Content Exchange, maybe?
Right. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I can't remember. Even though I helped talk about it a lot. I work closely with Audible over the years as well. And essentially what it does is it removes the friction, at least, of finding a narrator and creating an audio. It's still not necessarily cheap, and the economics are still, I think, in flux. But, audio is one of the few, I think, objectively judgeable, I'm sure I didn't say that right, ways to reach a new audience. Because the way ACX works, you get a bunch of narrators to send you samples, reading your work. You can decide whether they're good or not. You don't need an expert to tell you. You can listen.
Mm-hmm.
You can have your friends listen. And your fans, and then you can do a deal and pick. So audio is sort of unique that way. It gets much more challenging, for example, at the other end of the spectrum, if you want to do a translation.
Right.
Because you need somebody to tell you whether that translation into German of your book is even your book. I mean, I exaggerate for effect. So you can see why there's more friction there. That's going to be more challenging. But to the original question, is the transformation over? No. Has the path been validated? I think in many ways, yes. And look, I think 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, Porter Anderson asked me at Frankfurt, first he asked me when print was going to die, which I said never. And again, because it's a fantastic medium for certain people and certain types of stories. And then he asked, what self-publishing is going to look like in 10 years. And to me, it's or independent publishing, to me, it's an increasing convergence that at the end of the day, and this is my perhaps optimistic hope, but it's something I think we can drive towards, it really will put, I think, much more control, for better or for worse, in the hands of authors in terms of them having choices around how to best reach their audience. So if you're a poet, you might go directly to a poetry website. Mm-hmm. And publish your stuff there. If you've got a sci-fi fantasy series that you want to pump out one installment a month, maybe you do that on your own or you go to APUB. If you've got a big honking memoir, presidential memoir, maybe you go to the traditional route, which I think has as much legitimacy today as they ever have and will continue to. So, to me, the work is still afoot. I think part of the challenge is as each new technological development is rolled out, our impatience for the next one grows. People who were so thankful and amazed 3 or 4 years ago that they could publish their own book now want much more. And I think that's a continuing challenge that Amazon and other service providers will have to continue to focus on. But I see things moving in an author in control fashion.
Right. Well, let's finish up. You had mentioned that you arrived at a period when Amazon was kind of transitioning from being David to being Goliath. And then since then, of course, has gotten bigger to the point where you're hearing more rumbling around antitrust. I think sort of an academic theoretical arguments at this point. But if you were advising Jeff Bezos or just having a sense of where Amazon is in this transition, what does it need to do to be the smartest and most long-living Goliath as it looks forward, and this growth just apparently is going to continue?
Well, it's an interesting challenge. I mean, I think once you decide to become the everything store, you are automatically deprioritizing. So, for example, let me put it this way. Amazon is about doing everything. Storytelling is part of that. Audible, on the other hand, for example, is totally focused on storytelling. Random House, totally focused on storytelling. To me, there's an inherent challenge there. How do you continue to exploit other opportunities with resources at Amazon and continue to innovate in this space as you move resources to other areas? And by the way, as a shareholder, as a former shareholder, the decision to diversify and move resources around to other areas makes perfect sense. So I don't fault the judgment at all. I think Amazon is continuing to innovate. They recently launched, and I think it's still in beta, an enterprise platform to help serve those publishers that are not the largest and exist somewhere between independent authors and the largest publishers to help streamline the availability of their books, make it easier to work with Amazon. I think those types of continued efforts are super important. I do think Amazon is sort of a victim of its own success. What have you done for me lately is always going to be a refrain. That's what I was trying to say before in terms of, I think, the technological impatience. Like, we want our Alexas to work much better than they already are.
Right.
It's just a matter of understanding the pace of change is not always what we would like it to be, but think about where we've been. And that's why with all of this stuff, I do view us still as an inflection point. I think Amazon is in a very strong position as a seller of books. And I think they are in a very strong position as a service provider for independent authors because of the market segment share they have developed. I think Amazon Publishing has carved out a very successful part of the business for itself. Sort of rabid readers, romance, sci-fi, fantasy, mystery, thriller. It's the type of stuff where you reach the end of a book and you're in bed and you want to press the button for the next book. I think Amazon is excelling at that. As a publisher, I think that they are focused on other aspects of publishing as well, more literary stuff, as you can see in their New York office. I do think that it will always be a challenge, I think, for them to get the big book, just because of the nature of the way Amazon works. But I also don't know that they're interested in underwriting the big book because they're going to be selling that big book in electronic, print, audio, in every form. So I don't know if that answers your question the way
Well, it sounds like, and I hadn't thought of this before as a risk, but in other words, if the everything store strategy keeps spreading out, you think for people that really care about the book aspect of it, books being kind of in the DNA of the company right from the start, you think there's a chance of that getting diluted so that they're not quite as aggressive and revolutionary a force in that part of their business? Certainly,
I think as the business grows, resources get spread more thinly. Whether that impacts innovation or not, they spread more thinly to the extent that it impacts innovation, I don't know. I do think, I'm just trying to think how the best way to put this. I think when you have competing priorities, when you don't have a single-threaded focus, it's just a very different environment than when you are totally focused on just telling stories. And here's the thing where the siloing comes into play. Those folks in the Kindle group are totally focused on books and creating more ways to find more readers. And, Amazon deserves a lot of props, and I don't think this is going to change. If you think about how competitive the eye, ear, mind share space is in terms of all the things you can do on your device, it is remarkable to me that books, stories, including audio, have not only held their own, but excelled in that environment against video games, music, and movies. And it does harken back. And I do think it is in the DNA in this sense, from an emotional standpoint, to Jeff's first press conference where he said, look, we're going to be able now to read while standing in a checkout line. Mm-hmm. I mean, we take that for granted, right?
Yeah.
We don't even think about that now. When he said it, it made me laugh because I was still working on a BlackBerry, right? This was 2007. So I'm like, I can barely read emails on this thing. And the idea of Jeff standing on a checkout line was also kind of funny. And, of course, Prescient, now they've opened up stores in Seattle as tests without any checkout lines. But in any event, it's amazing to me the way we now take for granted the ubiquity of this content. And I do think there is a certain amount of books in Jeff's DNA. This is me talking, this is just my own thinking. Because it is his firstborn. Whether it was a stepping stone to something else, which I think everybody seems to agree upon, and I have no reason to doubt that, but books was a nice entry into this logistics business, so to speak, delivering things to people, whether it's digital or physical, whether it's content or toilet paper. I think that will always be sort of close to its heart, or the company's heart in some level. So, I do think that there is an incredible level of smart, energetic, ambitious people at Amazon, and that working in books, and that's an incredible asset. So, I'm optimistic that Amazon will continue to be able to hold its own. I also see great opportunity for others. I have a very optimistic view of the future of storytelling, and so. I think it's a great time to be a storyteller, and you just have to be smart about the different ways you reach an audience. And that, at the end of the day, is really what this is about, right? There is a storyteller, and there is an audience. The rest of us are either adding or subtracting value from that relationship. And that relationship is, how do I get my story to this audience? And I think what's happened over the last 20 years, 15 years, is this expansion of opportunities that will continue for the foreseeable future. And this is why I think at the end of the day, authors will have a little more control over how their ability to get to these audiences. Technology has really shortened the distance between reader and storyteller. And so I think it will only continue to do the same going forward.
Well, on that optimistic note, we'll bring it to a close. I have been speaking with Jon Fine, principal at the firm of Jon Fine Law and Media in New York City. Thanks very much, Jon.
You bet, Len. This has been a real pleasure.
That's it for this week. My guest next week will be David Steinberger, co-founder and CEO of Comixology, the digital comics and graphic novel powerhouse which Amazon purchased 3 years ago. The week after next, I will originate most of the show in Casper, Wyoming, where I plan to watch the total eclipse of the sun in the city that Darlene and I met and lived for 20 years. So it's going to be a great event. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles from Ocean Park, Maine. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to my show. Have a great day. Bye.